welcome everybody to the somewhat more remote and bucolic surroundings of Berlin for the second day of the conference Illiberal Democracy. The college likes to be low-key about its role in educating the leaders of tomorrow, but it is doing that. And yesterday, some of our future leaders expressed their dissatisfaction with the fact that great questions and problems had been laid out, but they still didn't glimpse answers to those questions, or at least not answers that they were prepared to accept in the time we had to discuss them. I can only say, looking at the list of distinguished speakers that we have with us, that today promises a yet more extensively well-informed, enlightened, and perhaps also, as Kerry emphasized yesterday, motivating dissatisfaction. I would like to thank the organizers again, Boris Forman, also for his very suspense-creating response to the keynote yesterday. Eva Atanassow, who has been responsible for initiating and consolidating this fruitful cooperation with the Hertie School, and Michael Weinman for his enormous amount of work that he's put into this conference, along with the others who will be chairing the last panel of the day. I'd also like to thank Irina Stulea, without whom no successful event would Please give a warm welcome to our guests, and thank you to our organizers.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for these warm words of welcome and praise. I also wanted to add to the list of thank you notes went to Ashley Brandon Landfried, who is the communication person on the side of Hertie, who was equally hardworking and contributing to this event, and especially yesterday, the opening keynote. We call this gathering here a colloquium, not only because we weren't sure how much of a public we would be able to attract, but also we really like to actually emphasize the discursive, dialogic, conversational nature of it. So we also didn't advertise papers and titles, but rather the panels are organized around a theme. Before introducing the theme and the questions for our panel and our distinguished panelists, I wanted to say a little bit about why we picked the title that we did, especially since yesterday where there were some very strong words articulated against the whole notion of illiberal democracy, which it was suggested should resolutely reject. Why gather scholars to think about this? So, in important ways, this colloquium of ours was inspired by a speech by Jan Werner Müller about a year ago at the Hertie School on the subject of populism, where Professor Müller, who has been very vocal on this, subsequently and previously suggested that the only way to introduce conceptual clarity in the question of democracy is to reject straightforwardly liberal democracy as a term, that's a notion sort of elevated by populists, which gives populists standing that they do not deserve. So everyone who actually cares about democracy, liberal democracy, cares about the democracy as we have known it in the post-war world, and some of us aspire to it, that we should be clear and not allow this term. Now, I am not so sure, and I guess my colleagues were sufficiently open-minded to join and say, well, let's think more about this. Is this so? And one reason why it seems to me it's worth thinking harder about this concept is because its genealogy is actually quite long. And I wanted to maybe, as a introduction to our conceptual and historical angle of this panel, to introduce a little bit of a record, maybe straighten the record a little bit about this concept. So illiberal democracies most sort of hit the front pages of the news thanks to Viktor Orban. It's often ascribed to him, and most specifically to a speech that he gave in July, 2014 before a gathering of students, I guess some other group of future leaders. So, and I wanted to adduce 3 sentences from this speech because they seem to me very illuminating. This is not to give Viktor Orban a platform, but rather to straighten the record about what he actually said, which would be helpful, I think, as we move on. So here are the 3 sentences first, and they're all from the same paragraph, but not in entirety. I'm cutting out some of the ornaments there. So, and I quote, "The determinative moment in today's world can perhaps be described by saying that there is a race underway to find the method of community organization, the state, which is most capable of making a nation and a community internationally competitive. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the explanation for the fact that the most popular topic in thinking today is trying to understand how systems that are not Western, not liberal democracies, and perhaps not even democracies, can nevertheless make their nations successful. The stars of the international analysts today are Singapore, China, India, Russia, and Turkey." One last sentence. While breaking with the dogmas and ideologies that have been adopted by the West and keeping ourselves independent from them, we're trying to find the form of community organization, the new Hungarian state, which is capable of making our community competitive in the great global race for decades to come. So one thing I would like to sort of highlight from these 3 sentences, and I'm sure we can talk about their content further, is that Orban is thinking about his plan for renovating the Hungarian state in a very global context. And this is something that also inspires this project, right? We insist that when we want to measure or somehow reflect on the standing of liberal democracy today, we have to go global. That somehow limiting our sight to what's happening in Europe or in the North Atlantic is insufficient, is no longer adequate to the question. I also want to point out that at this point, at least in his career, Orban makes no commitment to a regime type, right? He does not use the phrase illiberal democracy. He makes gestures, performative gestures that we can think about, but he does not so much care about what regime he's in. He cares about to make Hungary, if not great again, then certainly successful, whatever that means. Now, in an alternative genealogy, right, the phrase illiberal democracy can be traced to a 1997 Foreign Affairs article by Fareed Zakaria, who was at the time the editor of that renowned publication and actually refurbished its whole being. Now, the article opens with a reference to the American diplomat Richard Holbrooke on the eve of the 1996 elections in Bosnia, which, if you can remember back those days, actually meant to restore civic life and civic order in a war-ravaged country and society. Holbrooke articulated the following dilemma, and here I quote from Holbrooke and from the article. "Suppose the election was declared free and fair, and those elected are racists, fascists, separatists, who are publicly opposed to peace and reintegration. That is the dilemma." And now Zakaria comments, "Democratically elected regimes, often ones that have been re-elected or reaffirmed through referenda, are routinely ignoring constitutional limits on their power and depriving their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. From Peru to the Palestinian Authority, from Sierra Leone to Slovakia, from Pakistan to the Philippines, and we might now add Egypt, perhaps Israel, we see the rise of a disturbing phenomenon in international life, illiberal democracy." Zakaria, this is the end of quotation. So Zakaria proceeded to elaborate on this idea in a 2003 book he published under the title The Future of Freedom, a Liberal Democracy at Home and Abroad. And I would like to add that the conceptual framework for this book, just as much of Zakaria's actually scholarly work, and he was a scholar at Harvard before he sort of shoot off as a star of highbrow journalism, owes a great deal to the work of Alexis de Tocqueville. A name dear to me. So following on Tocqueville's thesis articulated now 170 years ago, Zakaria actually agrees that while democracy, understood as a social condition or as a strive for social equality, may well be, right, its global rise may well be in a sense inevitable, or in Tocqueville's word, providential, whether a global democratic world would be safe for the constitutionally bound liberal society remains very much an open question. Okay, and the purpose of this colloquium, I guess, is in a way to ponder that question and to bring together scholars from different disciplines and regions and also policy approaches to reflect on the current standing of liberal democracy. As you've seen from the program, we'll proceed in 3 panels. The purpose of this particular panel is to clarify our terms, to actually answer Jan Willem Müller's call for conceptual clarity to the best of our ability. And before introducing again the participants of that conversation, I want to state 3 questions that I've posed to the panel and would like to pose to all of us today. So what I would like to suggest is that we distinguish or approach the overarching task of thinking about the concept of illiberal democracy and the phenomena that it names or doesn't name by distinguish precisely 3 aspects of the question. First is conceptual and analytical, second is historical, and third rhetorical or strategic. And to put that in 3 questions, the first question would be, how new is the notion of illiberal democracy? When did it actually originate? And I already sort of put a little bit on the table regarding this. Secondly, how historically justifiable it is, or empirically accurate it is. Does it actually help name something now or perhaps in the past? What it is about? How analytically useful is it? And if so, in what way? And finally, with a gesture to policy implications, does this discourse or this concept advance our efforts to defend liberal democracy today? Or is it, as Jan Willem Müller has suggested, rather counterproductive? So to address these challenging questions, we have gathered 3 illustrious scholars here whose work both overlaps to an extent, but also, I think, diverges in interesting ways. And so I hope this would yield different points of view and a productive and pleasant disagreement. So I will introduce them in the order of speaking. The first is Professor Anna-Bettina Kaiser. Professor Kaiser teaches public and constitutional law in the law faculty of Humboldt University in Berlin. She holds a PhD in Habilitation, both from the University of Freiburg, and her habilitation, which appeared last year, dealt with the problem of exception in constitutional law and such central figures as Carl Schmitt. Professor Kaiser also holds a Master of Laws from the University of Cambridge, which I mentioned because there is a Cambridge connection in this panel, and for us interested in liberal education, a degree in musicology, which I think is very interesting. In addition to Humboldt and Freiburg, she has also taught at the China University of Political Science and Law in Beijing, and at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt am Main. Christina Landfried, our second contributor today, is Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Hamburg and Senior Fellow at the Hertie School of Governance. From 2014 to 16, she has held the Max Weber Chair at New York, NYU, and for the following year she was a Senior Fellow at NYU School of Law. She chairs the advisory board of the Social Science Research Center, BCB. She has taught at the Sciences Po, at the University of California, Berkeley, at the Yale Law School, and last but not least, in the joint Bart-Hertie venture on popular sovereignty. Who couldn't happen without Christina's contribution, so we are very grateful. Christina's recent work focuses on the political role of constitutional courts, the impact of she has also written on the impact of campaign finance on democratic governance and on the process of European integration. She's particularly interested in the potential and possibilities that difference, cultural and social differences actually afford for the possibility of global governance, or the governance beyond the nation state. Ira Katznelson, our third speaker today, is Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History at the Columbia University in New York, and this year's Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge, England. Ira has also taught at the University of Chicago, and also in the New School for Social Research, where he also served as a dean of the graduate faculty at some point. Ira's work straddles comparative politics and political theory, as well as political and social history, and I think one way to illustrate that would be to cite only 3 of his many, many titles. The most recent one, the recent book, is called Southern Nation, Congress and White Supremacy. It's actually co-authored with John Lipinski and David Bateman, and it's forthcoming this year. The award-winning Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time. And Liberal Beginnings, also co-authored, Making a Republic for the Moderns, which is very much textual, text-based study of the origins of modern liberalism. Professor Katznelson is also a former president of the American Political Science Association and, very importantly for us today, of the Social Science Research Council, which is in part responsible for his being here this semester. Before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to a very quick note on the proceedings. Each panelist will speak for about 10-15 minutes. Then perhaps they would have a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll open to floor for questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here at Bard College and at this conference. And I want to say right in the beginning that I will support the thesis of Jan Werner Müller that illiberal democracy is a very problematical term. And I want to argue from a legal or constitutional law perspective, as I'm here on the panel as the lawyer. So, democracy has always been an essentially contested concept. I'm referring here to Galli. And that's probably the starting point, that here, everybody here in this room, but also, of course, outside, has a very different idea of what democracy exactly is. And this is not only true for the present, but also for the past. So if we have a look at the article Democracy in the historische Grundbegriffe by Koselleck, we will see that there has been conceptual changes and all different understandings over the centuries. Thus, the new term illiberal democracy, coined in the 1990s, may just be another instance of an ongoing conceptual struggle. So, at the first glance, it seems to be legitimate. Why should we not talk about illiberal democracy? I want to recall, as Eva has already said, that the term is attributed to Fareed Zakaria, who has coined or at least used the term in a 1997 essay. And indeed, during the last decades, the allegedly new variant of democracy has triggered an enormous debate. Is illiberal democracy a paradoxical term, serving people like Viktor Orban as a fig leaf, as Jan Werner Müller argues, for example? Or is it a useful term helping to explain recent developments, namely in Eastern Europe? My stance on this is the following. The term illiberal democracy is source of conceptual confusion and not a mere perpetuation of old struggles on the idea of democracy. I want to add that the conceptual confusion is twofold or maybe even threefold. Why? Well, first, as I mentioned before, is the term democracy that is a contested concept, as we said, and I will focus on the term democracy in the following. But before doing so, however, I would like first to mention the other reasons for confusion, and that is the term liberalism, and that is a contested concept too. So what Fareed Zakaria does is he really combines the two difficult words, illiberal and democracy, and we can have struggle about the one side and the other. Thus, liberal can have an economic connotation, but it can also stand for a certain approach to human rights. The use of the term in the US and in Western Europe already differs significantly, so there's always some confusion if for example, Germans talk to Americans. What does liberal exactly mean when it's used? In fact, people like Orban and Erdogan are playing with the ambiguity of this term, even with the two terms, illiberal democracy. I think that in this context, in this conference, talking about illiberal democracy, illiberal is best understood in the sense of not observing the rule of law. Let me now come back to the term democracy and the question whether it's useful or at least possible to speak of illiberal democracy. Proponents of the term illiberal democracy might simply claim that the concept is sensible as long as we follow a thin or merely formal understanding of democracy that is more or less identical with the majority rule. So one could say democracy might be understood as a majoritarian democracy. And if I go back into German history, that was probably the understanding of the Weimar thinkers who said, yes, in its core, democracy is a formal principle following the majority. So, the alternative would be to insist on a substantial understanding of democracy, encompassing, for example, the media freedom as a precondition or as an essential part of democracy. And I do support this substantial understanding. But, of course, we could say some would argue in favor of the formal understanding, and me, for example, I would argue in favor of the substantial understanding. And in part, there is a similar discussion on small c and big C constitutions, right? Do we call a constitutional state a state who has a mere thin constitution, but does not follow a constitution in the sense of the French Revolution? And Dieter Grimm, for example, he would always argue we have to be very careful with our use of constitution. And I would argue in the same vein with democracy, we should be very careful when we use the word democracy. And there's even a similar discussion on a thin and a thick concept of the rule of law. So those are the parallel discussions that are going on. Thus, there seems to be a mere struggle between the formal and substantial understanding of democracy that seems hard to solve. However, the majority of theorists, not politicians, I'm talking conceptually here, who support a mere formal understanding of democracy, or who think it legitimate to equate democracy with the rule of the majority, they do not question the importance of rights and principles under pressure, for example, media freedom, in the regimes identifying themselves with the concept of illiberal democracy. They, the theorists, simply discuss these rights and principles as a question of civil liberties or the rule of law, not as a question of democracy. So, of course, I'm not saying like people like Orban think that these rights are so important, but the theorists, they would, all they are saying is those, the civil liberties and so on, they are just a different question. They, of course, they are important, but they are not a problem of democracy, but of rule of, let's say. So they separate the two concepts, democracy and the rule of law. And indeed, some German constitutional lawyers would probably hold that democracy and the rule of law are two separated concepts. They would argue with the German tradition of the 19th century Germany that followed the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, but did not have a democracy. So the two principles seem to be independent of one another. As a consequence, the problem the proponents of the formal, thin understanding of democracy have to solve amounts to the question whether, and that seems to me the crucial point, whether we can think of a democratic system that does not adhere to human rights and to the rule of law. My answer to this question is no. A thin understanding of democracy is a poor understanding of this principle. Think again of media freedom as an example. If free media do not exist, the majority will not be able to form its opinion properly. The majority rule will then produce distorted results. Conceptually speaking, there's not only a link but even an overlap between democracy and the rule of law. There will be never a viable democracy without the rule of law and human rights. Democracy, I would say, is bound to those two elements like Siamese twins. You can distinguish them, as we see in 19th century, you can distinguish them, but democracy will not survive without the other two elements. So, yeah, they are twins, but if they are separated, they die. On second thought, the dispute on the term illiberal democracy is even easier to solve. Even those adhere to a mere formal understanding of democracy need, as a basic prerequisite, the political leader's commitment to leave office in case she lost the elections. Yet, if we, for example, look to Hungary or to Turkey, even this last condition does not seem to be met anymore. Instead, the leading party makes structural alterations to the political system in order to prevent a change of government, like gerrymandering and so on. In sum, the critics are right, like Jan Werner Müller, they are right in denying the status of a democracy in such cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you also very much for the invitation, especially to Eva. I came late to this seminar on popular sovereignty, so we are now a trio Berlinale from Bad, Columbia, Hertie, B, BCH. And I will also take the 10 minutes and try to make my position on illiberal democracy. Unfortunately, I'm of the same opinion, like my neighbor Anna-Bettina Kaiser. I very much appreciated her arguments. She even cited my teacher Reinhard Koselleck. When you go to the Begriffsgeschichte and these big articles, more than 100 pages on democracy. And I agree with her what she has said about a thin understanding of democracy, about a thin understanding of constitutional law. But I'm here as a political scientist, and I want to make arguments from political science. I want to answer these 3 questions which Eva has put us. Why what is this empirically correct? Is this analytically useful? And is it an advance if you want to fight populism? And all 3 questions, I would say no. I think that we have illiberal policies. Of course, you can have some illiberal policies, but given what Anna-Bettina has already said, there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy if we understand with a democracy that we have a constitution, that we have basic rights, that we have freedom of the media, independent courts, that we have an autonomous civil society, and so on. So if we understand this with a democracy, and I would join here my neighbor, then there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy. These are contradictions. My interpretation why I would say this is also empirically it is not correct, because it is the understanding, if we say the self-understanding of certain politicians like Orban. They speak of that. And of course we have to take this as an empirical fact. But as scholars, we don't just go to the self-understanding of politicians. We have to analyze and say this is one part of the reality, but there is still more about. And if Orban says we are a democracy, even if not a liberal democracy, I don't have to accept it as a scholar. I go to Hungary and look how is the situation of the media, and I say this is empirically not correct. Is it useful? No, I don't think as a concept analytically, because what I think is behind that the political elites go quite an easy way with this term not to really take seriously the deficits of representative democracy, which are one of the reasons of the rise of populism. So here I want to think we should really take seriously, when we have a representative democracy, what are the deficits, because they contribute that we have the situation. I want to differentiate between 3 deficits, main deficits of representative democracy. One is a cultural one is an economic one, and one is a political one. And then make a sort of join a little bit with Klaus Offer yesterday's talk. So the cultural one. Cultural preconditions of a democracy, in the sense as Anna-Bettina Kaiser has shown us, means that the public has a sort of common understanding of the future. And this common understanding, of course, there might be different ways of ideas how the future should be. But you know, there must be at least the understanding that there is a pluralism, and we debate about this, and we have a basis. We want to discuss where do we go in the future. This is one of the cultural conditions of democracy. And I think this is, in representative democracy, this has been lost because we have secluded public spheres more and more. And we don't talk to each other anymore. You know, we have the secluded academic sphere. Of course, nobody of my colleagues at NYU would vote for Trump. But of course, this is something strange, that we don't even talk to the populists and then seem suddenly surprised. How can we be surprised if we only talk to our colleagues? So I think here, having sort of the common engagement for a future and discussing about different ideas, this is not really there anymore. And I would warn also the digitalization and all this naive way of dealing with that at the moment in Germany. This will not help here. The other cultural foundation of a democracy is the trust in democratic institutions and the trust in thick democratic institutions. And this is also very much lost if we look the last 20, 30 years. If we go to the European Union, go to the Eurobarometer, the latest data say that on an average, the citizens in these 28 member states, only 28% trust their parliament and only 27% their government. So imagine that. If only a third of the population trusts their own parliament, which are their representatives, elected representatives, there is no trust. So I would say in the cultural area, we have extreme deficits in a representative democracy. The political deficit is that there is more and more a gap between the people representing and the people represented. And many of more and more segments of the population don't feel to be represented anymore. They elect these people, but you can see from political science research that if the voter turnout is going down, these are especially people from the poor strata of the society. They don't elect because they think it doesn't change anything anyhow. So I think this would be a political reason. The economic deficit of representative democracy being a reason for the rise of populism is what Klaus Offe yesterday already said. This is the, the big difference between rich and poor worldwide. Even if many people electing for populists are from the middle strata, and it's because of fear of the future, still there is a substantive part to that. And we have this, I must say, wonderful book of Thomas Piketty, who is an economist, and he shows us a mechanism, not only just a situation, but a mechanism that the income from capital is always higher than the total growth of an economy. And he gives really empirical evidence on that, and for a long time, not just a short time. So he's also an historical economist, so he shows us for a long time. So this mechanism, if you combine this with the situation, for example, in the United States, I've looked this up for this our conversation. So at the moment, it's the 10 top percent of the American society. They have 75% of the capital of the wealth. The 40% have 25% of the wealth. So for the bottom 50%, nothing is left. And if you take this distribution, combine it with a mechanism, then you see we will end up in a huge discrepancy between rich and poor. And this is also a reason for the rise of populism. So, in the end, I think when we ask how can we fight populism, of course not if we underestimate these deficits and just speak of illiberal democracy. Klaus Offe yesterday had this cube of democracy where he said, well, one dimension is the popular sovereignty, one dimension is constitutionalism, and one dimension is the capacity of the state really to solve problems. I would say, well, I wanted to go to an artwork of an Hungarian artist, Agnes, and she has put our globe in unusual surroundings, in a cube, for example. So you put the world into a cube, and she said, we must find new ways, and I think here Klaus Offe has started already with going beyond the nation state, but I think the answer is not sufficient because I think the structural situation at the moment is such that everything what politicians are doing, even if they are learning, as his answer was yesterday, it's always too late. The economy is always too quick, globalization is too quick, technology is too quick, and we are behind. This is also what Reinhard Koselleck said. There are big differences in time dimensions. And this is why my result would not be very optimistic. I think with illiberal democracy, we won't be able to find that because then we don't discuss the real problems we are having in representative democracy. Thank you.
Well, first, it's a bit daunting to follow these two very lucid critiques of the term illiberal democracy. I'd like to defend the analytical use of a term that might be called non-liberal democracy. I should say at once that normatively I have no disagreement with anything my two colleagues have said. None of us in this room should wish to live in a democracy not nourished and surrounded by rule of law, by individual rights, by the notion of government by consent, by free civil society, by effective and trusted political representation, by confessional freedom, and by religious and other forms of toleration, all of which I would associate as the core conceptual ideas of political liberalism. But I think we need analytical tools to understand a continuum of types of regime. Now, this is hardly an original thought. Pick up Aristotle and you will see typologies of regimes, including the word democracy, centuries, millennia before anyone thought of the word liberal. There is an independent history to democracy, both thin and thick, not just thin. And there is an independent history of political liberalism. I'm not speaking now of economic or other forms of liberalism, which significantly predates mass participatory democracy of the kind that came into being only in the late 19th and the early 20th century in this part of the world. Further, I would observe that if by nothing else we mean by democracy a regime in which the people rule, which means some understanding of popular sovereignty, whereas once, at the very birth origins of the liberal political tradition, whereas once popular sovereignty was a radical outlier concept as against divine right or other forms of legitimation, today there is arguably no regime on earth that would not validate its existence as one or another form of regime based on popular sovereignty and in that sense democratic. We are sitting in a space that belonged to what was called, self-described, a people's democracy, not a people's authoritarianism or a people's something else. So the word itself has a complexity, a history, which cannot be, I think, contained or reduced to a democracy in partnership with constitutional liberalism, which is our collectively preferred mode of democracy. So to the extent to which we've been challenged by Eva to think historically as well as conceptually, my first thought, and I don't think it's a particularly profound one, but it's nonetheless a contextual one for our conversation, is that the terms liberalism, not illiberalism, but liberalism and democracy have an independent history and sometimes a history of vexed combination, contested and vexed combination. And therefore, we owe it to ourselves not to be content to say the form we prefer is liberal democracy, and therefore any other alternative cannot use the word democracy, which is maybe a bit of a caricature of what I've heard, but a friendly one, let's just say. Further, I think it's important, now I speak as someone at the edges of both history and political science. The political science self observes that in contemporary, say, post-Second World War political science, in the subfield that calls itself comparative politics, which for those not political scientists simply means the study of everywhere and anything that is not your home country. You can study China, Chad, or whatever, compare nothing, but if you're an American and you're not studying US politics, you're a comparativist. If you're French and you're not studying French politics. But the field of comparative politics has had a lot to say about democracy, its conditions. We heard really very important remarks about economic, political, cultural preconditions. We have a large literature. We have a large literature on the breakdown of democracy. Think of the work of Juan Linz and the late Al Stepan. And we have a lot of work, and we can judge it in different ways, on totalitarianism as a particular ultra-authoritarianism. But the category authoritarian or authoritarianism is largely treated as a residual category. But in fact, it comes in many modes. One mode could be called, as many have, Praetorianism, where you have military rulers. Latin America, which, for example, has a long history of Praetorian authoritarianism, which declares emergencies that can supplant the ordinary rule of law and democratic procedures. My question is not what Zakaria called illiberal democracy, and we could define it differently if we wish, potentially a form of authoritarianism which demands our attention distinctively and analytically in its historical location, namely, and by historical I mean time and place. And if so, the normative rejection of it does not answer that question of whether it can or cannot help us understand a particular form of authoritarianism which has some distinctive traits, including the rhetorical and partially substantive commitment to the thin version of democracy. Regular elections are not suspended. There's more than one party. There's more than one candidate. Of course, there's a range from how open and free these elections are. It tends to articulate commitments to aspects of civil society, to all the liberal pieces in a traumatized and unacceptable way, but nonetheless not in a way that the totalitarian democracies, and they thought of themselves as democracies, the Stalinists, the Hitlerite, the Mussolini democracies, all thought of them, they were totalitarian. They thought of themselves as, and called themselves better democracies than liberal democracies. The question is whether this illiberal formation, whether it's Erdogan or Orbán's or the Kaczynskis or what have you, has a distinctive enough quality, Putin, that demands our attention and turns the category of authoritarianism into not just a sponge word that soaks up anything that's not liberal democracy or totalitarianism, but which begins to make analytical distinctions. And unless we make those analytical distinctions, we will not be able to deal effectively, I believe, with that pathology, or deal with the question on the table of how do we act, what is the what is to be done question. And if I have a few more minutes, let me just say I want to take up a theme that Boris spoke of yesterday, which I thought was extremely important, namely, what is it about liberalism that makes it vulnerable to illiberalism? Now, yesterday you spoke about economic dimensions of tensions between property, markets, wealth, and liberalism. I want to focus in 3-4 minutes, if I can, just like CNN headline news or something, on aspects of the liberal tradition which make it vulnerable to illiberalism. And if you think about each of the core ideas of concepts of liberalism, rule of law, individual rights, government by consent, etc., we should ask, what is it about them that makes them vulnerable to illiberalism, as opposed to just being a good thing? Well, I would say the following. Liberalism is itself, political liberalism is a formula to manage what might be called the political sociology of differentiation, namely the modern worlds, by modern I mean from early modern Europe on, the modern world's separation of state and economy, state and civil society, state and other states. And what political liberalism is a formula for managing, liberalism is a formula for managing transactions between those differentiated elements. Political liberalism, as opposed to economic liberalism, is especially concerned with the state-society linkage, so that individuals are protected from predatory rulers because they have rights and there's a rule of law, and the state itself is permeable to the preferences of people in civil society. That's what the rule of law and representation implies. If that's what political liberalism is, a theory of transactions in a differentiated world, there are three vexing issues about which liberalism, qua liberalism, has little to say, even though it's concerned with them, but which can undermine its premises. One of them was spoken about yesterday. I won't repeat it. The two I have in mind are issues of security, physical and national security, and the second are issues of membership. Who gets to enjoy these constitutional rights? And so if you think about the rule of law, that raises questions of when must there be exceptions to the rule of law to protect human security. You find this theme in John Locke's discussion of prerogative power. You find it in Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers. It's embedded in liberalism, but what Locke and Hamilton say is there are times we have to stand outside the rule of law. I'm not now endorsing that, but I'm saying this problem is imminent to liberalism because when liberalism hits security, the outer reaches of rule of law are often called into question. Individual rights. Who is eligible for them? We don't have a world government. You have to belong to the polity. You have to be a member. Well, not everybody's going to be a member. What are the criteria of membership? Liberalism is only one criterion. A liberal citizen is meant to be capable of rational deliberation. But who's capable? John Stuart Mill said, backward peoples are not capable. Who counts as eligible or not? So it's imminent to liberalism, this question of who belongs and who doesn't. The list is too long, but just one more. Free civil society. Yes, of course, free media, free civil society. But what if out of free civil society, as Holbrooke pointed out in Bosnia, comes ugliness, comes viciousness, comes the wish to persecute? The liberal mechanisms port those views directly into the center of political representation. It's not entirely a foreign notion as we sit here today in current German aspects of current German politics. So I will stop. I have a longer list, but I'll end with a story. The story is something I'm doing research on now. The year is 1753. A liberal polity in its own time, but not quite a democratic one, in Britain, passes the most liberal immigration law in Western history to that date. It was called the Jew Bill. It allowed a non-Christian group to be naturalized and become fully English with all the rights of an Englishman. 5 months later, it was repealed. It was repealed after a massive civil society campaign that used the instruments of political representation, the constitutional rights of free Englishmen, to demand that high boundaries be put between us and them. And then the footnote has to do with my country, America. Once it was repealed, members of Parliament rose and said, but there's a back door. Under the Plantation Act of 1740, any white person can move to the British American colonies, live for 7 years, and be naturalized as British. And that includes people like Quakers, God help us, as well as Jews and Muslims. We must repeal that. And up came the leaders of the government and said, Actually, we shouldn't, because we need as many white people as we can find, because we have slaves in the American colonies. So the origins of religious toleration in the lead place are also deeply connected to forms of illiberalism. The final sentence is this: we cannot sanitize or expunge either the liberal or democratic traditions. We have to stare as hard as we can, as analytically as we can, at the porous qualities of both democracy and liberalism separately and together for the potential for deep illiberalism. And only when we do that can we be genuine guardians, effective guardians for liberal democracy. Thank you.
Let me first react to Christine Landfried. Well, we started in the same direction. Yeah, I would agree there are illiberal policies, but there is no such thing as illiberal democracy. However, then in your second part of, or in the second part of your talk, you said we have to look for the deficits in representative democracy. And here I would disagree, because I wonder whether in some ways this is not exactly the argument of the populists. They too would argue, yes, representative democracy has its problems and we want to address them. And I would say, no, we have to, there are reasons for the rise of populism, but we do not have to look at representative democracy, but rather different reasons. For example, in Eastern Europe, maybe we can learn that you need experience in democracy, that people have to learn to be a democrat, and that it's not easy, and that not in one moment or the other, or all of a sudden, everybody became a democrat, but instead it needs years and decades and maybe even centuries to learn it, to learn this principle, and maybe the experience is really missing. Or let's have a look at Hungary. Is it? I would agree it's the secluded communities, but maybe it's really the gulf between the countryside and the towns. So it has maybe not so much to do with Piketty, but rather that the divide between town and countryside that we experience also in the US and in other states. But that's not a problem of representative democracy, right? It's rather that we have different stages of development in a country. And as for the trust in the institutions, I wonder, can you really have the same data for whole Europe? Can you really compare the different countries? There are probably countries where we have a lot of trust in the institutions, and they are representative democracies. So I think in some ways it seems to me misleading to look to see the problem in a representative democracy. Also, what is the alternative? Is the alternative direct democracy with all its problems and with all its distortions? We would be very skeptical about that. And with Ira Katznelson, it's the other way around. We started on a disagreement, and then in the end I thought I can agree. So the disagreement is that I would still say that, as Christine Landfried, that it seems to me that illiberal democracy is a really confusing term and analytically not helpful. However, I would agree totally that we have to look at those hybrid forms of authoritarianism that are not that cannot be called totalitarian, that we really have to look at them and that we have to analyze them. But then you yourself, you said you call them forms of authoritarianism, and here, yes, I would say yes, they are authoritarian regimes, and I can agree on that. And I would say, yeah, then let's use that term with all its problems, but let's use the term authoritarianism, and then let's really, as you said, find analytical categories to really analyze what is happening, let's say in Hungary and in Poland. And I would agree that that these regimes demand our attention. And and as to your historical point, of course, there have always been regimes that call themselves people's democracy, but do we believe them? Are we convinced that they are a democracy? No, then I would say in that case it's helpful to say it explicitly. No, they are not. They call themselves, but we do not have to believe them.
Okay, thank you so much. So I just want to respond to Anna-Bettina Kaiser. I would totally agree that we have to look at other points, developments. If we go to Eastern Europe, there you have to learn about democracy. You have a different tradition. I just had 10 minutes, so this is why I was concentrating what are reasons for the rise of populism in representative democracy. Okay. And here I would stick to it and would not say the alternative would be direct democracy, but the alternative would be really to look to the deficits and do something about it. If a political scientist can show empirically that affluence has to do with political influence, so I think this is a danger for a democracy, for a representative democracy, and you know, all these populists are arising in European countries, in the United States, and I think the deficits, what has developed here, also this rich and poor and Thomas Piketty, it has to do that populists are saying we are not represented in parliaments who actually cannot do anything about problems that we have this development, which, for example, Piketty is describing. Insofar, I would see still really there is a relation between the real developments of representative democracy, which also have to do with what we discussed yesterday, between an internal difficulty in liberalism. When you have a liberal economy, when you have political liberalism, how does it go together? You have the privatizations, and I think all these problems, they contribute to the rise of populism. That we have, you know, so many things privatized the last 20 years, in the end of the 20th century, now in the 21st, we see the results. And I think you cannot sort of say this has nothing to do with these deficits. We have to take this seriously if we want to fight populism. So with regard to IRA, I would really not agree. One cannot say, as we are accustomed to a liberal democracy, nothing else is worth. No, then I would be misunderstood. I would not take this. I must say, I would totally agree, we need analytical distinctions. But illiberal democracy, this is not a real analytical distinctions. Then we would be more precise and would take the term of democracy or of authoritarianism and say, what are the criteria which we put to these terms? And then we would say, what are the indicators? We have a lot of indicators to measure how much democracy, where a democracy is defect. But to say that sort of they deserve distinctive quality, authoritarianism, of course, but then we really have to make these distinctions. And this is what I would criticize exactly with this illiberal democracy. This is not a distinction, really, in analytical. And it's not that I would normatively reject that. No, that would be too easy. No. I would say I need distinctions, analytical distinctions, and exactly I would go then with Gerd Werner Müller and say, well, if I define populism, one of the most important characteristics is anti-pluralism. And this is a criterion. And then I cannot combine this with democracy, because democracy has as a basic pluralism. And I agree, then make differentiations, but really do them. This is not with this term. This is, this is just another one, as you say, we are sitting here, I have been born in the former GDR, in a Volksdemokratie, which is a silly word, but of course, then I think you have really, if this is called a democracy, what are were the criteria of the GDR that they could call themselves a democracy? So I think I would agree, analytical distinctions, but exactly because of these reasons, I would not take this term. This term is really illiberal democracy, not analytically precise. So perhaps we should then go to different forms of authoritarianism, but would be just the same. So I would look for new terms. So then you need new terms with new criteria and new indicators. Then you make it precise. But I don't be against this because of a normative thing or because I'm just used to that. So this is not the point, because this would really be too easy.
If I'm certainly willing, I didn't invent the term illiberal democracy, and so I'm not going to defend it to the death, But I would defend the idea that we need to understand what might be called non-liberal forms of non-liberal democracy, because historically, most regimes that were democratic, and not just the GDR, which is a kind of false democracy, either predated even the imagination of liberalism, or grew up side by side with liberalism. And the partnership is, to me, utterly essential for a decent way of living. But it's not a partnership that has come easily, historically. And therefore, my point is that we need conceptual tools to understand both the vulnerabilities of liberal democracy to illiberalism, to non-liberalism, and to fill out much better than we have as students of politics the category of non-liberal democracy if we wish to defend liberal democracy. So we need both to understand the inside-out vulnerabilities and the various forms of alternative. And finally, I'm, unlike a colleague to my left, I'm not a Tocqueville scholar, but Tocqueville profoundly said that under conditions which he thought were irresistible, we could argue whether they were or not, of growing global egalitarianism, and we could argue about exactly what that means. The idea implicit in that was, because he begins early in that book with a chapter on popular sovereignty and treats America as the place, the direction to which we're all going. He says in America, the people rule as God rules the universe. And that's popular sovereignty. And that's where the world is going, toward legitimation of regimes by popular sovereignty. But he also warns us that that doesn't necessarily mean a liberal outcome. He was a kind of liberal. He was a strong liberal in his own way, a kind of aristocratic liberal. He also saw potential for despotisms of a kind that had not previously existed because of the new growing legitimacy of popular sovereignty. And I think that's the great challenge for us. Popular sovereignty is now a truism across almost every kind of regime, liberal and non-liberal. And unless we understand better and have good enough concepts to understand the non-liberal democracies, this hybrid form, this odd form, this discomforting and disconcerting form, then we're going to find it harder to defend and protect and guard our own preferences for liberal democracy.
Thank you. If I'm hearing correctly the disagreement, it's actually zooming in on one issue, whether pluralism is essential to democracy. And from a Tocquevillian point of view, the answer is very troubling, right? Because if you're serious about equality, if you're really, really serious about equality, as the Marxist-Leninist regimes were, then pluralism may be an obstacle, right? And then protecting certain legal and political rights may be an obstacle. Then you might have to take children and educate them and interfere with essential human rights, right? If you're really serious about equality. So, and also, I think a similar point was made by Carl Schmitt, and it's also, so it's troubling because it's troubling that you see a liberal and someone who was a very profound critic of liberalism agree on a diagnosis, right? So perhaps at this point I can just open the floor for questions and comments. If you could introduce yourself, that would be nice.
Hi, I'm Marcel Tesch. I'm a teacher of history and global politics at an international school in Berlin-Mitte. And my comment, I suppose, is a riff on what Professor Katznelson has said, and it's addressed to Professors Kaiser and Landfried. If we conceive of democracy as inextricable from an idea of liberal human rights, then I think it does beg the question, when did America become a democracy? Was it in 1789 when the Constitution was promulgated? Was it in 1964 when full voting rights were established in law? And so if you conceive of democracy as inextricable
Was it in 2047?
I don't know, I'm not into Tocqueville's school. If you conceive of democracy as inextricable from those rights and public goods, it certainly therefore restricts what we can actually call a democracy.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I asked myself the same question, and I haven't solved it yet, but I wonder whether it makes a difference whether we are talking now about the present or we are talking about the past. So in the past, or we can't put our measures, or we can't use our measures and transfer it to the past and then ask, have we seen in Athens or wherever, have we seen there a perfect democracy according to our measure? So that would be historically false, and we cannot expect the past to have achieved certain insights that we have now. So now you could ask again and ask me, do you want to say, so that's me, do you want to say that, or do you follow a history of progress then? So that's the second fault I did. And here I have to stop, and really I don't have a counter argument. So in that sense, probably I would say yes, I follow at least a certain history of progress, and then I would say it makes a difference whether in today's world, with our insights and with the experience of National Socialism and so on and so forth, whether we in our times, whether somebody like Erdogan or Orban says, I do now follow an illiberal democracy. So that seems to me a quite different story than going back to Northern America and in the 18th century and asking, so was that a perfect democracy? They didn't have certain insights we do have now, and so that's probably my answer.
Christine?
Yes, perhaps I would add to Anna-Bettina Kaiser with regard to your questions. If we go to the United States, it's of course a long process. You only have to see at all the books, the volumes Bruce Ackerman was writing, you know, from one constitutional moment to the next. You beautifully see how there were interactions between politics, courts, civil society. So you see a process. And then I think the really important question is what you were asking, that is there a progress? Is it going in a certain direction? And I would say a modern understanding of constitutionalism, we should be very cautious with progress always going in the best direction and demystify this. Not all technologies, modernity going to a better direction, but still stick to some basics. This is done in a very good article by Ulrich Preuss on new constitutionalism. And I think it's roughly the sentence, we should demystify progress, but still have an understanding of progress. And this progress would be constitutional democracy, I think. We should stick to that. There we should not be... and then I think take into regard what Ira just has said, what are the vulnerabilities of liberal democracy? I think this is very important always to see this. There are specific vulnerabilities, because even if it's going in the Tocqueville that we say all over the world, the people will become in the direction of equal. This is really a formal equality. We did not go, if you look today, in the direction of substantive equality. So I think this is really a vulnerability of liberal democracy, that we have, even if we have the same voting rights, and we see that people who are of the lower strata of society don't go to vote anymore because they don't think that these parliaments will do anything good for them. So you have a formal equality of voting, which is very important. But I think going to the globalizing world, there is no real equality. So I think this is also a vulnerability. So I think it's all a process, and I still would say, well, we should not give up all ideas of a progress. This would be horrible. If we just say, no, we give it up, there will no progress be. Not at all. Also, Klaus Offe yesterday was optimistic. He said there is a learning capacity of the political elite. I'm skeptical of that. But still, we need it, you know. If we don't take what Macron gives us as a window of opportunity, what shall we do? You know, we have to, at some point, not as scholars, we cannot be optimistic or pessimistic, we have to be realistic. But as citizens, I think we should keep this door open.
Would you like to comment?
Just for 2 sentences. More than one thing can be true at the same time. The United States was, at its founding, the pioneer constitutional democracy. It had an electorate of only white men, but the world there was no other electorate of only white men with almost no property requirements, who formed an electorate within the framework of a constitution that guaranteed all those rights to those people that you spoke. So it was, in that sense, to me, the American Revolution, I think Arendt and others were wrong, was more profound in some ways, or at least as profound as the French. But at the same time, it was a society born slave, as well as free, and a society that lived ultimately on the steady expropriation of native settlers. And you could not write the history of the 19th and 20th centuries from a Native American point of view as a history of progress, but you could write the history of more inclusive constitutional democracy from an African American point of view, ultimately as a very uneven form of progress. Kindly, Eva mentioned a forthcoming book of mine with co-authors subtitled, it's about the period from Reconstruction, 1877 to the New Deal, and its subtitle is Congress and White Supremacy. Congress is as the representative core institution that Locke tells us is the heart of any good liberal regime. And white supremacy, alas, triumphed in just that period in law, in Supreme Court decisions, and in other practices. And that didn't make the United States not a constitutional democracy. It made one a deeply flawed constitutional democracy, that had faced up to the question of membership in a very particular and very ugly way. So it's a shorthand answer to whether two things can be true simultaneously.
A student.
Should we collect some questions?
Yes, perhaps let us collect a few questions because we have technically only 15 minutes left, so maybe we can do 2 rounds of 3. Christian had a hand earlier, so maybe we can start with Christian.
Okay, my question goes to Christine Landfried, but maybe the other can also comment about it. It's about that you so strictly refuse the concept of the liberal idea or the non-liberal, as you framed it, because I think it's useful. I mean, not as some positive description of how, as a normative model of how we should organize a political community like Orban is doing. That's not the way that I view it. It's more this critical perspective. I mean, we talk about defective democracies, flawed democracies, and I guess illiberal democracy give us an idea of where the defect takes place. And in the core, you have the idea of a representative democracy, and I guess that's exactly the point where we can use the term illiberal, because we see the formal mechanism of a representative democracy still working, the electoral connection between the people and the political elites. But at the same time, especially in the United States, but more and more in European countries, you see that just specific interests get into the political process and translated into public policy, the interests of the big corporations and of rich people. So there is, on an institutional base, everything is functioning, but there is something wrong within this functioning institutional structure, and this might be described with illiberal democracy. This is my understanding. I'm not quite sure how your approach would be in reaction to this.
Maybe I'll take 2 more, Carrie and then Anna.
This, I guess one question, or I really appreciated, Ira, your contribution in terms of the historical perspective and bringing us back to, here the panel is conceptual and historical perspectives. And I'm wondering if we also might want to add in something like anthropological perspectives. Because it seems like, to the extent that regimes are calling themselves a liberal democracy, it's worthwhile, using that term to figure out what they're doing and make sense of what's actually happening on the ground in such a case. And I also think from a historical perspective, to connect to the first question that was today, maybe perhaps provocative here. If you look at the United States in the 20th century, and you look at the split between what was happening at home versus its policies abroad, one could easily, I think, in some ways say this isn't a liberal democracy. On the one hand, democracy at home. On the other hand, fomenting authoritarian takeovers in Guatemala and Chile and the Congo and tons of places, right? So is there a way, I mean, this is just a question, right? As we think about the different ways in which these terms fit together or break apart, is there value as well, again, from a kind of embedded perspective in which we're really looking at historical cases and thinking about how they fit into the term rather than coming from a sort of top-down normative approach that's saying, like, this is what democracy is, or this is what we want democracy to mean right now, and therefore other understandings of the term aren't really helpful in getting to that point.
Thank you. One more question, Lang, and then we'll have a responses, and then Florian, I've marked you for the next round.
So my question is about, can you describe in concept what is the division that you mentioned? Because it seems like we picked up this idea of division when the populism is winning. So what is the concept of division in this sense? And then what is the legitimate division that we're facing right now, and then how can we deal with it? Is it we deal with this division problem by deepening the liberalism or democratization more of the society? Because it seems like if we emphasize we go more liberal, it seems like we are fighting against popular sovereignty, then we are losing.
Okay, maybe I could invite you to respond. Yeah, and
So I will try to give an answer to your question. why I don't like this term of illiberal democracy, though, as you say, of course, this happens in democracies. These people are elected in representative democracies. Also in Germany, we have now quite the biggest opposition in our parliament is from the AfD. So this is why you ask, why not take this term? I would say I don't want to take it because, of course, it consists of two terms, illiberal and democracy. And for me, democracy is connected with substantive values, which populists don't treasure. So democracy is about not only rule of law, it's about rights, it's about media and so on, we all know that. And this is why I think I would take it as something that the populists themselves describe once they are a government like in Hungary, but also as let's say a movement in Germany or a political party. They describe themselves, and I would take this as really as a term they use and say, well, you understand yourself like this. I go to your documents, what you are saying, how you are arguing in parliament, and then I put this in my analysis as one factor of the reality. But I would never say that this is illiberal democracy, because part of this term, democracy, doesn't fit to anything what they are aiming at. They are in the system, they use the electoral law, okay, but I think this is not enough then to take their own term. I would take their term as self-description, self-understanding, which is also a reality. This is always a fact. But then I would say, now I analyze the whole situation, and there I think we should find another term. And we should find real criteria. One could start with Müller, but there are also other criteria. What characterizes, for example, one criterion which characterizes populism is also an understanding of the ethnic nation, feeling like an ethnic nation and not so much as the demos. You know, and all these things, there are several criteria, so I would prefer that to make it more precise.
Did you want to respond to Karen?
I wanted to say something about the last question, and in particular about the current moment and how we guard it and how do we deal with things. It seems to me that for those of us who care deeply, all of us do, about liberal democracy, the substantive, decent democracy, then it's our obligation to ask, what are the conditions under which citizens will feel a sense of obligation and loyalty to liberal democracy? What are not just the macro conditions that Christine talks about, but also the various institutional arrangements that make it possible for the full range of citizens to develop a sense of attachment and loyalty and obligation? What kinds of rhetorical and normative appeals be made, and what kind of instrumental policies are required? And the last thing I would say is that the populists, and here I speak mainly of right-wing populists, is they put together two questions, which Ofa yesterday talked about in the imagery of vertical and horizontal. Populists are always saying it's us against them, the elites, the political class, the ruling class, that's a left-wing version, the people who are dominating, who own the wealth, who have the power, and we are the people against them. The second opposition is us against them in either ethnic or religious or racial terms about membership. Them, those people, are not us. They cannot be inside our game. And what the populists do is they conflate and join both issues together. It is our job, it seems to me, those of us who really care passionately about liberal democracy, to separate those questions, to insist that the the dynamics of representation, political equality, a threshold level at least of economic equality required for meaningful citizenship, and so on, be addressed in an appropriate bundle of institutions and policies, and that the membership question be also addressed, but addressed not by conflating them and joining them together, as the populists do, often in a very ugly combination.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if I can just throw in a remark that it seems to me liberal democracy is not, partly what I was trying to show, is not necessarily Orban's self-understanding. He doesn't use the term in that, he's playing with it. It is as an analytical term most, I think, prominently introduced by Fareed Zakaria as a scholar, qua media star. But it also dates back to a liberal theorist and thinker, Tocqueville, whom I profoundly, respect. So in that sense, the term is not suspect to me in its origins, and it's the fact that Tocqueville actually might agree with Carl Schmitt about some fundamental diagnostics of modern society, and Max Weber and others, that if we commit to equality, our commitment to liberty becomes a question, or that it's actually very difficult to hold together both, then it seems to me the term is merits, right? It names something and merits to be taken seriously, but maybe if we can continue. Yeah. Florian is now first.
Eva, maybe
I'm sorry.
Maybe we can say who uses the term for what reason. Yeah. For example, as far as I understood Fareed Zakaria, he used it actually to criticize developments, for example, in Russia. And
in the US.
Yeah, and in the US. So he had that critical background, and he said, yeah, okay, we have a democracy, but see the flaws, and that's super problematic, and therefore I call it illiberal democracy. But when I think Erdogan used the term, as far as I know, and so now the same term is obviously used for strategic reasons, and there we should be very careful.
We didn't really, approach the strategic question fully yet, so perhaps. Okay, so last round, perhaps. I have Florian, Michael, and John, and Boris. Yeah.
I'll try to simplify and hope to be forgiven for this. Thank you for really a lot of very useful distinctions and differentiations across the panels, including Klaus Offe last night, during the day. Just to make it a little, to keep it simple, your three vexing issues of liberal democracy that continue to have to be addressed, either the economic security and membership. Just sort of a quick question to each of you. To what extent, if at all, would you consent to a description of populism that sees as perhaps another common feature? It's an empirical, analytical question. The bracketing of the first of these issues, the economic, what I think of basically problems of capitalism or of managing capitalism, depending on where you want to go politically, including, I think, very usefully the issue of state capacity and the idea of member stateness as a sort of the sort of solution that Klaus Offe was tending towards. That issues of security and issues of membership, which are of course real challenges, but that those get emphasized as the exclusion or in complete abstraction from the economic one, and that B, they get mischaracterized also, partly because of that abstraction from the economic in the fuller sense. Is that clear enough as a sort of yeah. So just to sort of is that really perhaps one of an additional sort of necessary feature of what we think of as not illiberal democracy but populism, or whatever your preferred term is, or not? Is it two dimensions?
Thank you. Mike?
Thanks, everyone. I think I feel incredibly vindicated, so I'm grateful. Thank you for vindicating us. And aside from that deep contribution, I guess, we all sort of identified ourselves with certain hats, even though we wear multiple hats, so rights of law, political science, history, and then as the historian of philosophy, let's say, as the student of the history of philosophy, which is my preferred hat, I guess I just wanted to throw out there the possibility that it's necessary to do something that we in our time don't do that much, which is to offer a definitive classification, a definitive system of classification, and that I take all the contributions today to be really pushing toward a better classification of regime type. Christine, I think in your third response, to Ira, you really got at this, and Ira, in your initial comments, you got at this, and of course, that's where you began, and I just wanted to throw out there something that already came up in a sense, which is Aristotle, and if we, shockingly, which is if we pervert Aristotle's incredibly basic schematism a tiny bit, and instead of saying, does one rule, a few rule, or many rule? In other words, we need to both, what I mean by a definitive system of classification is something that's both normative and descriptive. It's both empirical. It's not Plato, right? So we do the Plato style, like, typology, but we're not going to do that, I'm suggesting. But why not do something like Aristotle's, pervert slightly one, few, many, and introduce the term anachronistically of sovereignty? So you have the sovereignty of the one, the sovereignty of the few, the sovereignty of the many. The problem that we're really, really getting at, I think.
You got it, Montesquieu. Right.
Sorry?
This is Montesquieu. Go ahead.
Well,
It's also Hobbes.
I prefer to pervert Aristotle than to go with, we could do this through Montesquieu too. But anyway, just to say, take popular sovereignty, take the rule of the many, and what distinguishes it, this illiberal, liberal democracy thing, is very simply there in Aristotle. This is suggestion, tell me what you think, right? Illiberal democracy, what we really mean, is what he calls simply democratia, this condition of the rule of the many irrespective of normative perfection of the system, so to say. It's the perversion of politeia. It's the perversion of constitutionalism. So why isn't Aristotle simply right, so to say? In other words, that what we're trying to name with illiberal democracy, when we're honest with ourselves and not just being allergic to the term altogether, is a form of constitutional democracy that seems to have somehow lost the Constitution, strangely. So it's so not democracy, because democracy is constitutional, politeia, that's our norm, that now we don't want to call it, for good reasons, analytically now, not normatively, we don't want to call it democracy. But why isn't that simply right in a sense? That basically, among other forms of popular sovereignty, totalitarianism being another, you have these two interesting ones, constitutional democracy and this, whatever name we want to give it, non-liberal democracy. Would that help? Sorry. And
so we're going to rename it Bard College Berlin and Aristotelian University.
What was the Bard College?
In my email signature, it already said.
What's his name?
No, its name is a liberal arts
Liberal.
university,
Oh,
but I said it should be renamed.
Okay.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, what's occurring, I grew up reading democratization literature and all of this stuff about development post-war Europe, and people talked about when a country became a democracy, a consolidated democracy, a liberal democracy. And is a liberal, already what a liberal democracy should look like now, anything like what we felt it looked like in the 1950s? In the 1950s, there was no talk of gender equality, it was illegal to be homosexual in most countries, there was the death penalty everywhere. In France, it was abolished in 1976, I think. So we've completely moved the goalposts. We're still talking about a concept that we think should be described in much the same way, but over 70 years, our actual practical application of it has dramatically changed. And a lot of the things that we call liberal democracy are actually reactions against all of those changes. So aren't we just dealing with actually a different sort of cultural idea of what you know, the important individual rights are?
Thank you. Boris, you want to add?
I will hold back and
Okay.
I'm more interested in the answers than in my question.
Thank you. Okay, so takers? Go ahead.
She starts?
Well,
Well, so I will start with the first question with this, how do populists, not governments, but also the movements, deal with membership and how do they relate this with the economy? And I think that this is it's a very important point which already also Ira mentioned as also for liberal democracies a problem with the membership. We know that, I think it would make sense to say, especially in with regard to membership, it's a characteristic of populists to put out foreigners, to have walls, and if not walls, but not to be in favor of migration, for example. So I think they have here a very clear answer, which of course, if we go to the real world, and you brought in the economic point, then this is not possible anymore. So I think this is here what also Klaus Offe yesterday said, they don't have a concept for that. If you see not only membership, but also the economic situation, you cannot bring this together. You cannot go back to the Middle Ages. So we have a globalizing world, and there we have, open borders, and the question of membership is, again, there we see how complex the subject is. Also for liberal democracies is a big problem. Who is included and who is not included? Who is a citizen and who is not a citizen? And if we go to all this literature written, there is one I think the term is already catching a lot of our horrible reality, which is called the term expulsion. We have already citizens who are not only the question of membership, but it's about expulsion. This is what Saskia Sassen has written a book about. And there you see people are what she is calling living on edges. It's not, again, about cities and the periphery, but they don't belong anywhere. So they are at the edges. So here you can see what also Ira said, that this is one of the vulnerabilities of liberal democracies about membership. And here you can see, this is why it becomes interesting then, populists deal in a very special way with membership, but then they would not solve the economic problems. So I think this is a very important point, and I would not have an answer to that. The second, I like very much your approach with the classification, starting with Aristotle, and one could then take make it more concrete or more precise, saying what are the answers of a liberal democracy to the points you said, to sovereignty, to constitutionalism, to the capacity of the state, and how do populists answer that? So this would also be a way to classify it, to start really from the substance of constitutional democracy, not going to the mistake, what Ira said, taking this as the normative because only we know it, but saying, well, we have 3 dimensions, perhaps we have even more than these 3 dimensions, because I think we should also go to beyond the nation state. But if we take these 3 to start with and then look what are the criteria, how they deal with that. So I think this was, I would like this approach, to have a classification in that direction. And what was the last one?
The cultural ideas.
Different ideas of what liberal is and liberal democracy.
Things have changed since the 1950s.
Yes, but I think that, I think it is an important point because, for example, with the victory of Trump, this was an important point, that there were many sort of liberal brokers in the United States with regard to gender equality, to many things which didn't belong before the 1970s to a liberal democracy, and then they were against it. But one has to look this. Then there come all the aspects come in again. It comes the economy in. If you you have problems to send to give your children a breakfast before they go to school, then you don't like to be liberal when it comes, how to name certain places and how to be liberal in other areas. So you become illiberal because of other reasons. So I think it is really something which was also in a secluded way. We are all in favor of liberalism. We are all in favor of these rights of equality between men and women. But there are still segments of the population which are excluded from that. And so they are sort of taking this as sort of being in opposition to this. This was, I think, very obvious in the United States, and then one has to think about, well, why do these people then elect somebody like Trump, who is the best symbol for this establishment, if you are against the liberal establishment? But I think liberalism I think this is something you have to see. To be very liberal and very open as a society is easier when the borders are closed. The borders are not closed anymore, and therefore it becomes more difficult. And of course, being a cosmopolitan elite, we profit from that. But there are many people who don't profit from that. They don't profit from open borders. So, and they think, well, this liberal society, this is for these people who are, flying around and damaging our environment. And I think here, again, we have seclusion. And we have expulsion. And it's only a liberal society parts of that. If you look globally, all the developing countries, we are sort of exploiting. So I think this is why the liberal part is only for parts again of the population.
I want to start with you. In some ways, I would say, one could argue that these regimes are just supporting the ideals of the 50s. But in some ways, like Hungary or Poland, for example, but in other ways, they are introducing new things we wouldn't have dared in the 50s, like the problem of the separation of powers. Yeah, they are not respecting the courts. They are trying to find new judges, and and so on and so forth. So I would say this goes a lot beyond the problem of gender and all our modern rights and so on. So I would say no. You're right in so far as especially in Poland and also in Turkey we see this backlash, but unfortunately Erdogan and Kaczynski do not stop there, but they go beyond. And as to the question of membership and security, I would say, for example, Orban and also Erdogan, they use these criteria for strategic reasons. So, for example, Orban, he knew exactly that he would win the elections if he uses really the argument that so many asylum seekers and refugees are coming, and he knew that the population would be afraid of what could happen, and so I think it was really a strategic use, and we can see the same strategic use in Turkey when Erdogan used the Gülen movement to say we are in danger, we have to guarantee, or we have to be aware of the security problems. As far as we know, there was no danger from the Gülen movement. So I think those are most of the cases strategic arguments. And Aristotle, as I have read Aristotle, yeah, he warns, of course, of a perversion of democracy. But I wonder, for example, in Hungary, do we see a perversion of democracy? Does democracy shows itself from its dark side, or is it rather that one leader, one government, tries to take away the democratic prerequisites from its people through gerrymandering? Through oppressing the press. So I would say, yeah, Aristotle is a wonderful starting point, but still, we, as Ira said in the beginning, we have to look for new categories, and illiberal democracy does not seem to be the last word, the last term.
One quick last word. Just empirical matter. There are today, by various, the most accepted classifications, something like 63 million people who are classified as refugees in the world. The United States, under the Obama administration, admitted not 1 million, but 100,000 a year, deeply vetted, and not one of those 100,000 each year has been connected to acts of terror, etc. Mr. Trump said we reduced this to 40,000 for security reasons, but under implementation it is reduced to between 10 and 15,000. So a country which has a Statue of Liberty priding itself on open doors, in the people who are most faced with statelessness, which Arendt reminded us is the worst human condition in modern times, are being absolutely denied. This is the product not of rational public policy in a country so pluralistic and heterogeneous that no one notices these refugees, but as a rhetorical strategy of populist membership questions, so Florian's issue. But I don't quite agree that they bracket the economic issue in actual having policies to deal with the economy and poverty and so on, but they don't bracket the issues rhetorically. Certainly not in the American version, but not in the British versions or I don't know enough about the AfD to know, but in many other places, they say there's been a corruption by elites, various forms of what Miss Sarah Palin called crony capitalism, which betrays the open markets, and what we will do is create a legitimate opportunity economy. So I think populists do talk about it. I mean, it may be again a rhetorical matter, but they combine the economic with the membership questions into a very powerful and appealing brew. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we feel, what do we do when large numbers of fellow citizens, for whatever good or bad reasons, come to vote for parties which explicitly challenge free press, explicitly challenge the law courts' autonomy, and the rule of law, and so on. It's not as if this is just a matter of Orban or 5 bad guys or Putin, but there is a genuine appeal, and we have to understand why under contemporary cultural, economic, political conditions that appeal exists, and how those of us who find that appeal abhorrent and wish to defend and guard liberal democracy, how do we create imaginative institutional and policy solutions that will appeal democratically to our fellow citizens? And that's a big challenge.
Thank you. If I can quickly jump in as well to Jonathan's question, which is very provocative. I think that's right. It seems to me they're going back, even in response to Anna, Eastern Europe in the 50s was not where Western Europe in the 50s was. We had constitutions, but they were not what you would call constitutionalism. And actually, one supporter of Kaczynski at some point broke out with his judicial reform and said, I was for this movement, but where I see this judicial reform going, it's going back to communism, which we fought, right? So there were appeals, not only cultural conservatism, but also I think structurally that these regimes may be going back to the pre-1989 in more than one way. And on the issue of Aristotle, I think Aristotle is extremely helpful for our discussion because it helps us separate a structural criteria for identification of a regime from normative ones. And we have also added strategic or rhetorical, which maybe. And so it seems to me that that is very useful. The difference from our point of view, from Aristotle, is that Aristotle considered three types of structural, right, three structures, regime types, and we only have one. I think nowadays we only have popular sovereignty, i.e. democracy of some kind, and so we need to introduce distinctions between these different self-proclaimed democracies and try to understand in what way they meet one kind of criteria or not. Thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you.